iOS 15.1 Beta 3 brings ProRes support to the iPhone 13 Pro. Let's take a look at what's new right now. But before we take a look at what's new, let's look at Filmic Pro version 6.17, because this was actually released before Apple released ProRes support for the iOS 15.1 beta. So now's a good time to compare the differences. So when you go into Filmic Pro, you can choose your format. You have 8-bit, 10-bit, and oh, look what you have here. You have ProRes support, but not just singular ProRes, not just one flavor in the ProRes family. No, you actually have ProRes 422 Proxy for super light workflows, or ProRes 422 LT, or ProRes 422, or 422 HQ. So you get 4 different flavors at different bit rates that is going to give you flexibility as far as the size of your videos are concerned. Now, if you're shooting in HD 1080p ProRes, you can choose a frame rate up to 60 frames per second. If you're choosing 4K ProRes, which we're going to switch to right now, there's 2K, there's 3K, there's 4K 2160p. So we're shooting 4K ProRes. Let's go back to our frame rate, and here you'll see the frame rate maxes out at 30 frames per second for 4K ProRes. So just some things to keep in mind there. All right, so let's go ahead and actually shoot a video and see the size of the video since we're capturing in ProRes 422 HQ. So I'm gonna speed it up here. There we go, 57, 58, 59, so about a minute of video capture at ProRes 422 HQ in 4K 30 frames per second. And I don't know if you can see that right here, but yeah, that's nearly 6 gigabytes, 5.74 gigabytes of storage space used for just a single minute of ProRes video capture. So let's go ahead and save this video to our camera roll. We'll open it up in the Photos app, and notice the Photos app recognizes, yes, this is a ProRes video. So if we tap the info button, that nice iOS 15 metadata view, you can see 4K 2160p, 5.74 gigabytes, 30 frames per second, and it does recognize it's ProRes, although it doesn't denote the flavor of ProRes being used within the ProRes family. Now, let's compare what we just saw with Filmic with Apple's native implementation of ProRes capture. So if we open up settings, go to About, you're going to see I'm running software version 15.1. This is beta 3. You can see the build number there. And this phone, the iPhone 13 Pro Max, features 256 gigabytes of storage. Now, I also have a Pro with only 128 gigabytes of storage, and there is going to be a difference with ProRes capture. I'll show you that in a little bit. So now let's go into the camera settings in the Settings app. So tap Camera, and then you'll see at the top Formats, and that's where we can go to enable ProRes video capture, as you can see right here. So look at the details here. It says show camera control for ProRes. ProRes is one of the most popular formats for video professional post-production. A minute of 10-bit HDR ProRes is approximately 1.7 gigabyte for HD and 6 gigabytes for 4K. And that's pretty much right in line with what we saw with Filmic. So let's go ahead and enable ProRes just like that. And you also notice another detail, ProRes capture is supported for up to 30 frames per second at 4K and up to 60 frames per second at 1080p. Now, I like to go over here and preserve settings. You'll find the Apple ProRes toggle there. This will keep ProRes enabled when you close out of the camera app and you come back to it. That's just a nice feature to have. So if we go into record video, you're going to see HDR video is enabled. So that's one of the biggest differences between Filmic Pro capture in ProRes and native capture of ProRes in the stock camera app. You see, Filmic doesn't support HDR for ProRes video capture, whereas the stock camera app does support 10-bit HDR HLG video capture. So here is the stock camera app. You can see ProRes enabled at the top if you swipe up. You can also toggle ProRes from this area as well. If you want to do that, you can just turn it off or just tap right here to turn it back on. And you can capture in ProRes with any of the 3 cameras on the iPhone 13 Pro Max or the iPhone 13 Pro. So you have your wide angle, your ultra wide, and your telephoto lens, all of them able to capture in ProRes. Now notice what happens to the max time value when I change the resolution and frame rate. So 4K down to HD, you get a lot more time to record ProRes there. So 50 minutes at 30 frames per second, and as you can see, 25 minutes at 60 frames per second. There's a big difference there. Now watch when I switch over to 4K, only 14 minutes, and now it's asking me to address some of the storage issues that I have on this phone. Basically tell me go over to storage settings and yeah, clean your phone up because we don't have a lot of space left. And you can see when I switch to 60, ProRes video capture is not supported at 4K 60 at all. So I have 4K 24, enable ProRes again, 15 minutes, and then I switch back over to 4K 30. You can see it drops down a minute, and you can see that storage settings pops back up. So let's go ahead and capture some video here in 4K at 30 frames per second. And like we did with Filmic, we'll capture about a minute, and I'll speed this up. All right, so we're 56, 57, 58, 59. Let's go ahead and stop. There we go. And so you can see the max time did go down another minute. So again, it's prompting us to address these storage issues. So we'll go ahead and tap on the storage settings button below the max time. And that'll take us right over to our iPhone storage in the settings app under general. And there we can address any issues with storage, delete photos or applications or data associated with those applications. So that's just a nice little feature to have. Now let's go into our camera roll and compare. You can see it does recognize it as ProRes, and you can immediately see a difference though with this capture versus Filmic's ProRes capture. Notice the difference. You see that? This one is not in HDR, whereas this one is. You see the light bulb? Notice the light bulb. You see how it's brighter there in that area? So that is a difference to consider. You can see it also says HDR in the metadata, so you get 10-bit HLG HDR, 5.7 gigabytes 4K 2160p at 30 frames per second. So again, a minute of video, about 5.7 gigabytes, nearly 6 gigabytes for a minute of 4K 30 frames per second video capture in ProRes 422HQ. And you notice another thing with Apple's implementation, you can't choose between differing flavors of ProRes. It defaults to 422HQ. It is what you get, and that's pretty much it. Now, whether or not Apple will add that ability in future updates remains to be seen. Hopefully they will, which will help a lot with the storage issues. Speaking of storage issues, if you have a 128 gigabyte iPhone 13 Pro, well, you're going to notice that ProRes capture is supported for only up to 30 frames per second at 1080p. So just something to keep in mind there. Now, another little feature that came to iOS 15.1 I want to point out here has to do with macro mode. So you'll notice on the iPhone 13 Pro, when you get close to a subject, it automatically enables macro mode. So this will use the ultra wide camera to allow you to get close to the subject and bring out those details better than you could with just the standard wide angle camera. So it uses a little combination of the wide angle camera mixed with some machine learning and allows you to have some really awesome macro photography. You can see how that frame moves around automatically, switching intelligently between the wide angle and the ultra wide. Now here's the ultra wide in manual mode. Obviously it's already on the ultra wide, so no need to switch to the auto macro. But when shooting with the ultra wide, it just doesn't look as cool because your field of view is just so distorted. Whereas with the auto macro, your focal length doesn't change all that much. Now, let me show you the new toggle in 15.1 beta 3. If we go back to settings and go back down to camera and scroll all the way down, you'll find auto macro automatically switch to ultra wide camera to capture macro photos and videos. So I'm going to turn that off and watch what happens now when I get close to a subject with the wide angle shooter. So here we go. Yeah, doesn't give you those details at all because it's stuck on the wide angle camera. It can't intelligently switch over to the ultra wide and bring those extra details in. Now, if we switch over manually, yeah, you can get those details, but again, your focal length changes drastically. So that's the benefit of really keeping the auto macro on. I wish there was a toggle within the settings or within the camera app to just enable or disable that, because that would be a lot better solution than having that over in the settings app. Hopefully Apple will add that in the future as well, because I do like auto macro. I think it's really useful. I just don't like it automatically turning on all the time. I like to be able to control that directly from the camera app interface. So ladies and gentlemen, what do you think about iOS 15.1 Beta 3? It is a pretty major update for iPhone 13 Pro and Pro Max users. Let me know down below in the comments section. This is Jeff with 9to5Mac.